Hello and welcome. Welcome to I think it's the 10th episode of our India Studies series of webinars that we have been doing for more than 1 year now. In every month, mostly the last Tuesday of every month, we invite senior scholars, very well accomplished scholars in different facets of India studies, literature, history, music, films, Ayurveda, philosophy, religious studies, and so on and so forth. Very happy, I'm very happy, excited, grateful that Professor Trivedi accepted my humble invitation to come and share his vast reservoir of publications on post-colonialism. Something that I used to teach long back, more than 10 years back at NC State, believe it or not. I was so fascinated by his writing that I found every single word that he presumably wrote that time in 2010. And so I found him again through emails, and I requested him to present this webinar because he presents something really unique, how post-colonialism is not exactly one monolithic phenomenon, and of course he will tell us more. But without further ado, I should read his bio with all the humility of the host. So, Professor Harish Trivedi, formerly Professor of English at the University of Delhi, was visiting professor at the universities of Chicago and London. He is the author of Colonial Transactions, English Literature in India, 1993, and repeat publications in 1995, and co-editor of Interrogating Post-colonialism, Theory, Text, and Context from Shimla, published in 1996, 2000, 2006, and Postcolonial Translation, Theory and Practice, several reprints, The Nation and the World, Post-colonial Literary Representations, 2007, and Kipling in India, India and Kipling, 2021. I'm just amazed by the range and depth and width of the post-colonial phenomenon that he has really taken apart, I think, in my humble opinion. Festschrift for him was published under the title India and the World, Post-colonialism, Translation and Indian Literature, Essays in honor of Professor Harish Trivedi, 2014, edited by Ruth Vanita, and with contributions by Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, Zhang Longxi, Susan Bassnett, David Damrosch, Robert J.C. Young, and David Dabydeen, among others. And with that, I humbly invite again Professor Trivedi to present his wisdom on post-colonialism. Welcome, Professor Trivedi.
Thank you very much, Pankaj. I'm delighted to be at this new university, Flame University, and to be speaking to you and to your colleagues. While I notice that apart from some old friends from the UK, with whom I was chatting a moment ago, Sharda and Sugi, who are themselves academics, and also Sugi is also into the post-colonial. I have a very dear friend whom I can see, very dear old friend, Daniel O'Connor. Hi, Dan. Yeah, Dan was teaching English with me. We were colleagues at St. Stephen's College in the 1960s and 70s. So that's more than half a century ago. And it's delightful. I've not been to Britain for a while yet, so I haven't seen Dan. Nobody has been anywhere recently, but wonderful. And you'll be pleased to see, Pankaj, that I brought half the audience with me. So about the post-colonial, I'm not going to read out a written paper. I've never done that. I belong to the Indian oral tradition, especially when lecturing. Sometimes I do have to write because it's to be published, but that's the last resort. And one other thing that I wish to say in the beginning is, I look on the post-colonial now as an old friend, as a kind of companion of many decades, which I enjoyed having, and nicely interactive and enriching the relationship. I don't know whether I enriched the post-colonial, but the post-colonial certainly enriched me. And I also feel that I've lost touch with the post-colonial in the sense that I don't even know where it's gone over the last 10 years or so. I hear less and less of it, and its whereabouts are currently unknown. After 2010 particularly, it has had receding visibility in my mind, to my observation. And two years ago, just before the pandemic broke, I was at a conference in China, in Shenzhen, not a good place to be, but before it broke. And one of the fellow participants there was Robert Young, who in 2001 had published a 600-page history of post-colonialism. Dear friend of mine, teaches at Oxford and New York. And that's a masterly work. I mean, that's one of those indispensable works on the post-colonial history, no less. And I said to him, it was, I mean, I don't know whether I should be quoting it. It was at a bar late in the evening. And I said to Robert, I said, Robert, what happened to the post-colonial? Where has it gone? And he said, oh, it's still very much there, except that they now call it decolonization. So that was his answer. He also assured me there is a pretty good, well-selling series of very short books, bite-sized books. I'm sure they are the only ones that will continue to sell as we go further into the future. The Oxford series called Very Short Introductions to ... And it's very popular, really. And he said that he had contributed the very short introduction to post-colonialism, and in no time it had sold 50,000 copies. So it's still there somewhere, but let me recall the golden age of the post-colonial as I see it. And as I promised in my abstract, I will look at three phases of the post-colonial very briefly. One is the pre-postcolonial. The other is, as I said, the golden age of the post-colonial, and especially with reference to its so-called radical potential, politically speaking. And also, of course, the divisions and fissures within it as they emerged. And then I will talk about two more things. I hope I'll get through all that within the next 30 minutes or half an hour. The last two things that I wish to talk about is the post-postcolonial, the pre-postcolonial at the beginning, the post-postcolonial in the end, and even beyond the end. I wish to read out a couple of pages, which I've actually printed out. I do write from time to time, and I'll read out those on the indigenous post-colonial, not the Western post-colonial, but the post-colonial as it is to be found on our own subcontinent. So that's the plan. The pre-post-colonial, nothing emerges out of nowhere. We know that. What was there before there was the post-colonial? I began teaching English in India in 1967. And what did we have then? What were the critical schools or practices that were prevalent? I think it was still very much new criticism. It was still Cambridge and Chicago that were contributing, close reading, the three fallacies that Wimsatt talked about. That's what we were concentrating on and practicing at that time. There was nothing, there was no feminism, no literary feminism. In my understanding, it began in the late 60s, early 70s. By the time it reached India after a jet lag of 5 years or so, sometimes 10 years. So we hadn't heard of it then. And for some years, for about a decade after I had begun teaching, Edward Said had not published Orientalism. Midnight's Children came out a couple of years after that, in 1878 and, not that long back, 1978 and 1981, these two books, which are the pillars of the post-colonial, I feel, in their own different ways. One, a critical theoretical book, and the other a work of fiction. So all that was still in the future. We watched it happen, we watched it grow. So one has a kind of a historical perspective on it. And many things have come and gone. I mean, it's not only the post-colonial that seems to me to be in an eclipse. Where is postmodernism? I think that has suffered a worse fate than the post-colonial. where is a much touted new formation, critical formation, called cosmopolitanism. They didn't fly even as much as the post-colonial. Now, these things happen. The way I see it, it's a bit cyclical. It's not even cyclical. It's just one phase after another. I think in the American Academy, one needs a big new buzzword every 20 years, a big new movement. And it helps a number of people make their careers. It probably advances the academic field in many ways. And then it's exhausted in about 15 to 20 years, which has traditionally been thought to be the span of a generation. So that's how I see these things. And sometimes they arise simultaneously, sometimes one after the other. And that is why there's nothing to mourn or lament in the eclipse of many of these critical movements. So that's another thing that was with us in that pre-post-colonial age was what used to be called internationally new writing, new literatures in English, and what used to be called Commonwealth literature. That was very big. And there was also within India, Indian writing in English, a label that I found very interesting because it wasn't even Indian literature in English. Nobody was willing to grant it the status of a literature. We just called it Indian writing in English. And that continued for a very long time, until the West began recognizing it and giving it some space, whereupon we also dropped the level writing. And it got subsumed anyhow in Commonwealth literature. The Commonwealth literature, the whole movement began in 1965. There is an organization called the Association of Commonwealth Language and Literature Studies. It was founded at the University of Leeds. That's very important. All this comes out of the West. It does not arise in the colonies, which explains to a large extent what the trouble is with it. If you're representing the colonized, what kind of a say are they going to have? It's true that there is Gayatri Spivak, and there is Homi Bhabha, and there are others, Dipesh, for example, Arjuna Padurai. But where are they? They might have begun in India, but where are they to be found? Unless they migrate to the American Academy and speak from, and I use my word pretty advisedly, from an American position, occupying American turf in the academia, I don't think their word travels. I mean, who was Derrida until he gave lectures in America? Everybody has to go via America, whichever country they come from. That happened to the post-colonial as well. So when I'm recounting my own interaction with the post-colonial, what I'm really trying to do is to construct some kind of a history of English studies in India. It's not me alone. We were all in it together. And these were the disciplinary formations that we went through, that we participated in. Salman Rushdie wrote an essay which is compiled in his first collection of essays, Imaginary Homelands, in the 80s again, which is titled Commonwealth Literature Does Not Exist. Well, I mean, he was speaking contrary to facts. It did exist. Rushdie was called a Commonwealth writer, but he was protesting that this is the category that he's not happy with. And that was one of the major initial protests and demonstrations against the label the post-colonial, against the Commonwealth, which facilitated the coming in of the post-colonial. Rushdie, in fact, said in that article, he gave many reasons. He said, I think I'm a British writer. Now, that was his problem alone. Not many other people from the Commonwealth could claim or would want to claim that they were British writers because they had not, unlike Rushdie, reached a public school, a big public school, Harrow, at the age of 13, then gone to Cambridge, then, for what it is worth, married an English wife, and so on. They were all in their own countries, many of them. So Rushdie claimed exceptionalism here, I think. He said that he was a British writer, and therefore he should not be thought to belong to a secondary and inferior category called Commonwealth literature. Somehow, when post-colonial literature came, in fact, in that essay, he said Commonwealth literature should not exist. Later on, rereading that essay, I said, that sounds like a fatwa. Why is he talking like this? What's he saying? I mean, it's not up to us. There are many other factors determining what will run and what will not. So the Commonwealth was seen to be a satellite of Britain. Politically, the Queen was, in political terms, the Queen was always the head of the Commonwealth. It did not rotate the headship among Commonwealth countries. So similarly, in literature too, I think Britain was asserting a kind of supremacy over other literatures being written in English, and that's Commonwealth literature was by definition only literature written in English. This was inherited by the post-colonial. There are many definitions of the post-colonial, and there are 2 or 3 things wrong with them in particular. As I pointed out, the book that you mentioned that in my biodata, Interrogating Post-colonialism, this is the Viceregal Lodge in Shimla, where we held that conference out of which the book came. Deliberately ironical. The post-colonial was housed in the Viceregal Lodge, as used to be, where people like me would not have been admitted during the British rule. So there we were. Now, in India, I think the post-colonial begins to be noticed around the year 1993-94. It takes that much time to travel across. So my friend Meenakshi Mukherjee and I are office bearers of that Commonwealth Association in India that I talked about. And on taking over, the first thing we do is not to speak of the Commonwealth, but to organize a conference titled Interrogating Post-colonialism. Already this transformation is happening. An even more dramatic example of that is that there was a reference book in 2 volumes, the Routledge Companion to Commonwealth Literature. I was also asked to contribute to it, and that's what it was called when they asked me to contribute to it, when I sent in my contribution, when the entries were edited, and when they were about to go to press. And suddenly we got a letter, all the contributors, from the editors saying, this is to inform you that these volumes, so far called the Routledge Companion to Commonwealth Literature, are from now going to be called and to be printed as the Routledge Companion to Post-colonial Literature. This seemed to me absurd. I mean, as if there was no conceptual difference between the two. But what they were trying to do perhaps was to capitalize, like good publishers always, on the buzzword that had just arisen. And the Commonwealth could not turn into the post-colonial in any meaningful sense just overnight, just by change of one word in the title. But that's what happened in that case. We began in India by calling it, though the association was Commonwealth, we called the conference the Postcolonial. And Dan, I can see you loud and clear now. You're filling my screen. That's wonderful. Yeah. So this is the book of that conference. And we raised a number of questions regarding the formulation of the post-colonial that had already taken place in England and by three fairly influential authors called, in the book that they compiled, that they wrote together, The Empire Strikes Back. Not many people could understand the major theoretical contributors to the debate, but they could understand a kind of a manual for students' use, as it were, that was put together by these three Australian writers. The Empire Strikes Back. What did they say? That the post-colonial begins not when the colonizers leave, as common sense would suggest, but it begins with the moment of colonial intervention. This defies all sense, but that's what they argued, and that's what's been accepted to be. The second thing that they said was that it'll be only literature written in English. That will qualify to be post-colonial literature. They said something else, which fortunately has faded, is just dropped off, but they said it's in print, one can still look it up. They said in order to distinguish post-colonial literature from British literature, we shall use the word English with a capital E when we refer to British literature, but when it comes to post-colonial literature, we'll refer to English with a small e, as if it were E. Cummings writing it. Now, that seemed to me, people talk of the colonial cringe, but if one were to cite an example of the post-colonial cringe, that would be Exhibit A, in my mind. Champions of the post-colonial are saying we are in every way smaller than the home country. We are subservient to them. Another problem that arose, and this is the last one I'll point out before I move on, is that the definition that the post-colonial begins with the moment of colonial intervention applies far better in Australia, where the authors came from, in New Zealand, in Canada, in South Africa perhaps, but not elsewhere. In these countries, the White Commonwealth countries, as they were called before, in these countries, it's very difficult to tell anymore who the colonizer is and who the colonized is. They all look the same, they all behave the same. It's also very difficult to say when they became independent. They're still not independent. The Queen still appoints the Governor General. The Queen's head is still to be seen on their banknotes and on their coins and on the postage stamps. It's such an odd situation. They are the settler colonies. In my article in this book, that the Interrogating Post-colonialism, no, I suggested that there are two kinds of colonies. The white colonies, which are the settler colonies, which the British claimed to settle for the first time as if they had never been settled before. And the unsettler colonies, where there was a civilization, fully developed civilization already in existence, which they came and unsettled in a country like India. And everybody knows when we got independent, even Rushdie knows that, who got many facts wrong about India. But he knows at least the date when we got independence. So the colonial and the post-colonial are very clearly marked as separate from each other, as the opposite of each other. In a country like India and in many African countries, in the rest of the subcontinent, Indian subcontinent, but they are not marked at all, it seems to me, or in very small ways. There's more continuity than rupture in the white colonies. Now that cleared the pitch of the post-colonial right from the start. I think that defanged it, that neutralized it from having any kind of a radical political potential, that stopped it from offering any kind of a strong critique of what the colonizers had done to us. To me, the post-colonial is not only about what they did to us, which continues even after independence. It's equally about how we feel after independence not only about the British who have left, but also about our own rulers, Indian rulers. And it's not that we are entirely delighted with them. There are many problems that arose after we became independent or persisted even after we became independent. And the responsibility for resolving those problems has been lying with us. Anyone who keeps on blaming the rulers, the erstwhile rulers, is an ostrich. This is what post-colonial literature should reflect if the term post-colonial is to be understood correctly. So the vital difference between the white colonies and the non-white colonies, let's not call them black, and the date when the post-colonial begins. As I said, they vitiated the whole project of the post-colonial. The post-colonial became a family quarrel between Britain and its white colonies. Now, still, there were some things that were enabling. It's not as if it was all bad. It focused attention on the colonial period, whether from the moment of colonial intervention or beyond that, or both, which had not happened in the West at least. The West began to take notice of British colonial enterprise, its beginnings, its peak, and where it ended, and what it was succeeded by. And when I say the West, in Europe, there was an Orientalism, which was even stronger and abler than British Orientalism. The most scholarly of all the Orientalisms was the German Orientalism. The French were not doing badly either. The British were lagging behind after having begun fairly well. That's my understanding broadly of Oriental scholarship, good Oriental scholarship. Said calls it all bad. I think he's half wrong. Some of it was good, some of it was very enabling to us and to them, and some others was not. But one has to be discriminating. One can't paint it all with a black brush. No. So, I mean, there's this saying about knowledge being power. The British had all the power and very little knowledge. The Germans had no power in India, but all the knowledge, or much of the knowledge. These are formulations of the West applying to different situations, which cannot be applied to us as if they were universal. Let me move on. The interrogation, the history, the interrogation of the post-colonial from an Indian point of view. There are some foreign contributors here as well, including two authors, I think, here, who wrote The Empire Writes Back. We have Gareth Griffiths among them. We have Bruce Bennett, and Helen Tiffin too we had invited, but she could not come. Those are the three authors. There are one or two other foreign authors, but of the 20 chapters, most are written, about 15 are written by Indians. I'll next look very briefly at Robert Young's history of post-colonialism. I'll highlight only 2 points in it, which may be of relevance to us today. He began to talk like a good Marxist, and most of the post-colonial critics were Marxists of one shade or another, and a good thing too. Robert Young said that there was the colonial even beyond the British, even beyond British Empire. He tried to point out this very simple thing, that there was the Spanish Empire. There were other empires all over the world, and we cannot separate them when it comes to post-colonial discourse. So he suggested a frame of thinking in the post-colonial, which he called tricontinental discourse. 3 continents, not only 1 or 2. Latin America as well in a big way, Africa in an equally big way, and also, of course, Asia. That was his frame. Also including French colonialism. Algeria, for example, is quite big in it. So he broadened the scope of the post-colonial in that history in a major contribution that he made. The other thing that he said in relation is also related to this first thing, is that India gets disproportionate attention in post-colonial discourse if we confine the discourse only to the British Empire or ex-colonies of Britain. Ironically, he said India still remains the jewel in the crown of the post-colonial. And he explained why this had happened. One of the reasons he gave was that there was a kind of an alliance, not if not a conspiracy, between the major post-colonial theorists and a major post-colonial writer, those being Rushdie and Bhabha in particular, but also Spivak and Said himself, who counted Rushdie as among the kind of intellectuals who would promote the cause of the post-colonial. I've documented all that in something I've written more recently. Not that I entirely agree with Robert Young, but he has two very strong points there about what was wrong with the formation of post-colonial discourse. As I said, in my own view from where I sit, this history, I mean, people write a history of something not when it is at its peak. I think Robert had a sense already in 2001 that this is what was happening to the post-colonial. It was fairly well spent, and that's when he wrote his history. Of course, many books came out in the decade that followed, which also contributed to post-colonial discourse in a big way, of which we can name two or three. A book came out, Beyond the Post-colonial, in 2006. Before that, the Cambridge Companion to Post-colonial Literary Studies came out in 2004. And from India, we held an international Commonwealth conference, which was in effect a post-colonial conference, to which Gayatri Spivak came, Homi Bhabha came, Ejaz Ahmed was there, a whole number of critics of the top rank were there. And we published 3 volumes out of that one conference, over 250 participants, which also used the word post-colonial. And that was in 2007, I think. We published those volumes together. So there was activity, as I say. I myself wrote, I think, at least 20 articles, apart from the books that have already been mentioned, Post-colonial Translation that I edited, other post-colonial references, even in titles of the books that I edited. And I wrote, I think, about 15 to 20 articles with the term post-colonial in the title. It was one of my central preoccupations for 2 or 3 decades, as it was coinciding with this period I've been describing, as it was a people all over the world. Except that my own sense of the post-colonial, because I'm located in India, was tempered or moderated by 2 or 3 other discourses in which I was participating at the same time. And I think many other Indian critics were participating. One of these was comparative literature. In India, there are 2 kinds of comparative literature: Indian comparative literature and comparative Indian literature. There's a point very nicely made by some of our elder post-colonial practitioners, particularly Shishir Kumar Das, who has done wonderful work in the area. We have enough languages and enough subcultures to keep comparing them within India. That's one category. The other is India on the one hand and other countries on the other, including the West, of course, mainly the West. So both these kinds of comparative literature were flourishing alongside. In fact, when I got back to India after my PhD from Britain in 1975, which was still the period dominated by English literature in India, I knew that I did not want to do too much English literature after that. I had been cured of it by my stay in Britain. I realized that I would never have had in India that British literature was not my literature. I had to begin working on something else, but there was nowhere to go. Said had not yet appeared on the horizon in 1975, as I said. So my first recourse was comparative literature. Alongside then ran the post-colonial and also Indian literature in its own right, without comparison, without the post-colonial frame. Indian literature, in particular Hindi literature, in which not only do I read, I also write in Hindi. And so do many other critics in India. This kind of not superficial street bilingualism, but scholarly bilingualism is diminished, but is still common enough in India. So that was again a kind of disciplinary formation. And is this in this larger context that the post-colonial was also one major strand. What has happened in the post-colonial period? My understanding is that though post-colonial was already in decline, something that knocked it off the pedestal altogether was the emergence of world literature. World literature does much of the same things that post-colonial literature did, or post-colonial literary studies did. It offers a kind of a corpus that is even bigger than the post-colonial, and therefore that incorporates the post-colonial. It may not have a reading practice of any kind that claims to be radical, except that the assemblage in itself suggests a kind of a reading practice which is more democratic than the post-colonial was, though it doesn't claim to be equally radical. I've been involved with a project in world literature. It's a history of world literature in 4 volumes that will be coming out in June this year. It began in 2004. That's how long it has taken us to wrap our minds and our computers around that project. But it'll be coming out this year. What I'd like to point out regarding the correlation between the post-colonial and world literature is that Rushdie got his wish. People did not call him Commonwealth writer anymore. They called him predominantly a post-colonial writer, and he seemed to be happy enough with it. But then, in several anthologies, at least one anthology, I think the Norton anthology, the latest edition of world literature, there is beyond the post-colonial, the section called post-colonial used to be the last, but now there's a section beyond that, and it's called world literature in those anthologies of literature. Now this has, nobody calls the old Greek literature and old Sanskrit literature world literature. They are contained within that corpus, but they're not identified as being world literature primarily. Salman Rushdie, who used to be called a post-colonial writer, is now called a world literature writer. He's been shifted from one category to the other. That is how world literature has subsumed post-colonial literature. As I promised, I remember, even if you don't, now I will write a couple of pages. I will read out a couple of pages which I've written. Let this be the end of my talk. And then we can perhaps have some questions and discussion. This is the article that I said I have written, in which the word post-colonial is still in the title. It's not yet published. It will be published this year, I expect. I mean, the editing has been done. The proofs are about to arrive. It's called Cambridge Handbook to Salman Rushdie, which reminds me of a very good joke. It's not a joke, it's an anecdote. As we know, Abdul Razak Gurna was the winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature this year. He's not only a novelist, he's also a professor. So he has to do academic things like Pankaj and I have to do, and a number of other people have to do. One of these things that he did was to edit a book called The Cambridge Companion to Salman Rushdie. And when when Gurna got the Nobel Prize, on Twitter, somebody asked Salman Rushdie, "Are you now planning to edit a book called The Cambridge Companion to Abdul Razak Gurna?" That's how these things shift. That's how reputations shift. So this is the Cambridge Handbook to Salman Rushdie, which is not edited by Gurna. It's edited by a British, also a British academic from Kent. What I want to read out is my bit in that essay, which comes at the end, about the subcontinental post-colonial, which goes well beyond Rushdie. Beyond the Anglophone post-colonial of the West, of which Rushdie is an exemplar, there exists an indigenous post-colonial comprising works by writers who have always written in a language other than English and still live in the country in which they were born. The novels which comprise what may be called the Hindi post-colonial, and I wrote an article on that in 2016, they seem in many ways rather more footsore than Rushdie. Their historical cultural range is wider, and their politics not skin deep, nor a matter of newspaper headlines, such as the politics in Midnight Children very often is, but it is the kind to permeate the whole fabric of society. In Phanishwar Nath Renu, a Hindi novelist, and his first novel, Mala Aanchal, 1954, we see disillusionment with independence setting in less than a decade. We got independence in 1947. This novel is already published in 1954, and it describes the period of our struggle against the British, but also the period after that, coming up to almost 1954. For example, we see disillusionment with independence in terms of an old Gandhian idealist preferring to kill himself than witness the decline of Gandhian ideals in terms of corruption, in terms of power grabbing, in terms of increasing casteism, and so on. In Shilal Shukla's novel Rag Darbari, published 1967, we find the cynically corrupt misuse of the newly set up grassroots democratic institutions. And in Nirmal Verma's novel Raat Ka Reporter, 1989, the pervasive fear that ordinary citizens daily lived under during the period of the emergency declared by Indira Gandhi is hauntingly evoked. The Pakistani writer Intezar Hussein's Urdu novel Tazkira, 1987, is, like Rushdie's Shame, concerned with the dire dictatorial rule of General Ziaul Haq in Pakistan, except that it never once mentions Zia even indirectly. Why? Because in that Urdu novel, no one dares to mention Zia out of sheer terror of him. Not even on the day when news comes in that he is dead. The terror still lives on. The Bangladeshi writer Taslima Nasreen's novel Lajja, or Lojja, as the Bengalis say, 1992, is a word that means shame in Bengali, Sanskrit, Hindi, and many other Indian languages. But when it was translated into English, it came out as Lajja is equal to shame, because Salman Rushdie had already copyrighted the word shame through his novel. It depicts Muslim fanatics in Bangladesh perpetrating violence against Hindus and driving a Hindu family out of the country. The novel was banned by the Bangladesh government, A fatwa was decreed against Taslima Nasreen and a bounty announced on her head. We are so ignorant that we think that this happened only to Salman Rushdie. A bounty was announced on her head, and she has been obliged to seek refuge in a succession of countries from Norway to India, while books that she wrote later on were also banned repeatedly in her own country. Finally, a Hindi novel which sets itself up in a parodic intertextual dialogue with Midnight's Children is Kalikatha via Bypass by Alka Saraugi, published 1998, translated 2002. All the novels I have mentioned are available in English translation. In this novel, Kalikatha, three friends in Calcutta who were all born on the same day, the 1st of January 1925. As I said, it has a parodic relationship with Midnight's Children, this novel. These three friends decide in their teens, in the turbulent 1940s, that they may go their separate political ways, but will meet again at an appointed spot on their 75th birthday, which of course would be in the year 2000. But the novel is published in 1998. So it's just beyond that time frame. It's a nice twist of the plot through which the novel is published before that meeting can take place. The story goes back to the 1860s, and this time is correct, 1860s, not 1960s. The story goes back to the 1860s to depict an earlier phase of colonial rule, as well as the internal migration of a trading community, the Marwadis, 1,000 miles away from home, to the capital of British India, Calcutta, so that they can make capital there. They are still not quite integrated or accepted by the local Bengalis 100 years later. We talk about migrants being accepted or not being accepted and having problems when they go from other countries to the West. There is internal migration, and there is still hostility, widespread hostility, and lack of any harmonious relationship within India, these two communities. About half of the novel is set in the 1940s, when Indian nationalist hopes ran idealistically high, and the other half in the year 1997, with crass commercialism making the celebrations of the 50th anniversary of independence. In its historical depth, cultural complexity, and unremitting political satire, Saraugi's sobering novel perhaps trumps Rushdie's playful extravaganza. Rushdie's global reputation as a post-colonial writer far exceeds that of any of the subcontinental novelists whom I have just mentioned, or even perhaps of all of them put together. And that, I suggest, is what is wrong with the post-colonial. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Would love to take, let's invite all the questions. Thank you for reminding me of all your works that I used to just dive into and drink every word that you ever wrote in 2010. But let's have some questions. Would love to have a question by the other distinguished guests. All of them are, I think, professors, scholars.
Yeah, Pankaj, yes. Because you were saying to me,
yes,
when you were writing to me to invite, that you have read every word of mine, I put in the last bit, which has not yet been published.
Yes, but it does have the what I had I think recalled Taslima Nasreen and Phanishwar Nath, Renu, that you refer to them in your earlier works also. Because I think your works is, at least to my knowledge, is one of the rare publications which brings in all these multilingual indigenous or Indian post-colonialism, not in English, and that I at least didn't find anywhere else. Mostly it's all limited to English authors, but your works, they really bring to the fore people like Sheila Shukla and Rag Darbari, and so many more. Yeah. Questions from the guests, other guests on the panel, on the webinar. Professor Maya Dord, my colleague here at FLAME. Yes, Maya.
Thank you, Dr. Jain, for organizing this. And Professor Trivedi, we've been fans of yours for a long time, so it's such a treat. I'm so grateful to hear this today because I am that generation that has basically paralleled post-colonial studies. And especially through the PhD, etc., there was an assumption that if you're an Indian in the West, this is what you're going to do. So in many ways, I think Arif Dörlich had already stated in the post-colonial aura that the arrival of the third world intellectual in Western universities is the beginning of post-colonialism, right? And I think you traced that history wonderfully well. And as you sort of also mapped the further failure in some sense of what this category entailed, I wonder if there's another history that requires telling and you gesture to it. And this is the history of the deeply, as you said, the scholarly bilingual. And I'm thinking of everybody from Harivansh Rai Bachchan to Nirmal Verma, who all did sort of English degrees in the UK and then come back to only write in Hindi.
Yeah.
And there is a sort of active disavowal, right,
Yeah.
of the choice to be that post-colonial traveling, globetrotting, cosmopolitan, right, in that way. And even though it is seen as nativist versus cosmopolitan, I think there's something profound to that choice. And I wonder if, in a way, that story, which I want to mention alongside the other writers you also mentioned, I think J.N. Davy stands out as reminding us about our amnesia. And that was one of the most powerful things that sort of made me feel okay to not be post-colonial, at the time when it was trendy and such also. So if you can elaborate on that other history, sir. Thank you.
Yeah,
Great.
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's a very good and rich question, because we can divide the indigenous further into those who have clearly demonstrated that if they chose to, they could have written in English as well as they write in an Indian language. So the option, the choice there is that they made is there for everyone to see. And that makes them even more radical. I've always felt that many Indian writers in English had no choice. Let's begin with Salman Rushdie. Let's not pity them for not having a choice. Let us call them deracinated, linguistically at least, which they are, whether they've been living in England or America or whether they live in India. They're part of that very elite fraction. And while it has given them many advantages, it also deprives them of a functional bilingualism. One can't have everything. There are very few bilingual writers in India who have written both in English substantially and also in their own language. Dilip Chitre, for example. There are many other writers who have published in only one language creatively, but who have shown their total competence, I mean, excellence in English, in lecturing, as is the Indian method, extempore, and also in writing their essays and intellectual pieces in English. For example, Anantamurthy, for example, Nirmal Verma, a gay, we forget a gay, I'm going to speak on a gay tomorrow evening. I, I speak on someone or the other every day, it seems, these days. It's just been a busy month. I've given, I think, 10 lectures this month. But as it happens, I'm speaking on a gay. He was the Regents Professor in the University of California at Berkeley. It doesn't come easily to anyone to be that. And he wrote only in Hindi. He knew wonderful English. Another example that I'd like to give is even more extraordinary. I've written a memoir on him. I'll probably add to it a little critical piece. Friend of mine, Krishna Baldev Vaid. Krishna Baldev Vaid in the 1960s did a PhD at Harvard on Henry James, which was published by the Harvard University Press. Doesn't get better than that. It certainly did not do then in the 1960s. No Indian before him had done it. And he decided to stay on in the US and teach English literature. And he wrote a large number of short stories and several novels, beginning with his childhood, depicting his childhood. Some of them very, I don't want to call them postmodern. Let's call them Joycean or Beckettian, high modern. And he did all that writing in Hindi while living in America for 25 years with no Hindi community around him. In those days, Indians were very sparse. So that's an even more remarkable fact. He has a very nice short story which he wrote late in life, called Pravas Ganga. Unless you bring in Ganga, there is no meaning to any experience in so many Indian languages. So Pravas Ganga, he has reflected on, he has not written on his exile very much in America. He has not much fiction set in America, no. He has rejected all the obvious choices. It's not like Susham Bedi, for example. It's not like a number of other people who write in India, Indians who write in America about the American experience. One of the earliest being a man called Vijay Chauhan, again, a dear friend of mine, who wrote 2 short story collections set in the 1960s. He was a Fulbrighter in the early 1960s at Columbia. And he also stayed on there after a long time. But came back to India and lived here for 20 years too. And then he went back to Britain, to America, to be back with his family. Very interesting life trajectories. Anantamurthy, as we know, had gone to Britain to do a PhD. And he got so fed up with his PhD, and he got so fed up with England, I think, that he pushed that aside and began writing a novel in Kannada, in England, in Birmingham. Sharda and Sugi and Dan, we were all together in Birmingham. In Birmingham, he was doing a PhD in Birmingham. So this is the vitality of bilingualism. And as Maya put it, the option exercised by bilingual writers, by bilingually competent writers, to be creative writers monolingually in their mother tongue rather than in the language that they have acquired as well as anyone has acquired it. This is the most remarkable phenomenon. And I agree that perhaps we can have a separate chapter on it in the books that we write on the post-colonial. They deserve special honors. And as to what you said about the post-colonials from all over the world having arrived in America to mark the moment of the inception of the post-colonial, let me add one more thing. The biggest gain that we have had internationally from the post-colonial is that most, if not all, American universities have a post reserved for the post-colonial, at least one, if not more. And their idea of the post-colonial is that if the person appointed to that post is an Indian, he can equally well teach African literature. And if he's an African, he can equally well teach Indian literature. An amazing example is Edward Said himself. For Penguin Classics, he edited Kipling's Kim as soon as it came out of copyright. I'm sure they'd done the deal even before it came out of copyright in 1987. Penguin Classics say that each book should be edited again after 20 years. And they asked, when Said's 20 years were up, they asked me to edit Kim for them. And one thing I very rapidly found out, which I hadn't noticed before, is how shaky Said's basic knowledge of India is. He's marvelous in Palestine. He's even better in Western music. But what does he know about India? There are such howlers in his introduction. The notes I'm sorry to say, the notes were largely plagiarized. I would not say by Said, but by some research assistant from a printed source. abbreviated, but the same thing. It's a scandal. The post-colonial as conducted, as patronized, as taught. In India, there are no posts of the post-colonial, unless in new universities like Flame, they have one or two. Traditionally, there are none. Right. Thank you.
There's another question by my colleague Professor Ashutosh Poddar. The question is extending your post-colonial theory. Are you suggesting post-nativist framework?
I was never into nativism. So I haven't been there, I haven't done that. Yeah, there was nativism. There was I respect one of the big names in that field, Nemade, Bhalchandra Nemade, taught English. Again, same kind of syndrome. Taught comparative literature, wrote his fiction exclusively in Marathi, winner of the Gyanpith Award. Wonderful person, as polemical as Rushdie, if not most. Joy to be with him, to listen to him. So he was the leader of the nativist sub-movement, as it were, small movement, as it were. There's a book called Nativism in, of course, our discourse, critical discourse, edited by a student of mine who was also in that, but he's been into many things, even more than I have. Makarand Paranchape, from a conference that was held, I think, in IIT Kanpur. But if one wants to look at nativism, I mean, Ganesh Devi is the big voice who lent his weight, authority to nativism for a long time. I mean, these are some of the big figures in nativism. So if the post-colonial does not speak for us, how will we speak? One of the options, which, as I said personally, I would not be very enthusiastic about, but others are, is nativism. Post-nativism in this, yeah, you're right, post-nativism in the sense that, as I said, some of these critical movements run a long way. Some others peak and subside more rapidly. I think nativism, like cosmopolitanism in the West, was one of those short-lived things. But it doesn't mean that we can dismiss it. Nativism does not mean ultra-right wing. That's what people may suspect. No. Give it a chance. Go into it and see what arguments they're using and what corpus they're citing.
Okay, thank you. Next question is also from my colleague, one of my colleagues, Professor Kunal Ray. Kunal, go ahead, please.
Thank you,
Yes.
Pankaj. Thank you, Professor Trivedi, for your wonderful lecture. My question is about, do you think teaching post-colonial literature, especially teaching post-colonial literature in India, appear to be this English-only project? And that's perhaps one of the fallacies of doing or teaching post-colonial literature in India. And then we had translation studies where, so how do you look at this? And do you think the fallacy, or one of the biggest fallacies, is of thinking or imagining post-colonial literature as an English-only project?
Well, I mean, as you have already gathered, as I suppose everyone has, I look on it with great anger and indignation. I mean, this is ridiculous that in a country where at the level of literary literacy, at the level of being able to read a book in English, how many of us are competent in English? We only move amongst people like us, so we think the whole world is like that. But if we look at the India beyond, what an extremely small fraction of our society we are, and how unreal we are. This is, of course, part of the heritage of English, inheritance of English, and not only English language and literature, but English rule, British rule in India, which we have not modified, to say nothing of abolishing it, in any big way. I mean, the same law continues, the same procedures continue in society, the same courts are honored. So, I mean, not all of them. Some has been discarded. The trouble is that because of the clout that attaches to English language and by transference literature, it's very difficult for Indian languages to begin to claim and occupy a comparable space. In most universities in India, state universities, I don't know about private universities, they have their own ways of doing it or not doing it. But in the bigger state universities, there is a department of modern Indian languages where all the non-local languages are taught primarily at the level of language teaching, if people wish to learn that language, but gradually, increasingly also at the level of literature, a BA in that language and literature, an MA, and even a PhD. They are the centers of comparative literary studies. Not only comparison among the Indian languages, but between them on the one side and English and other European literatures on the other, by default almost. But they are the least sought after departments in the universities. This has nothing to do with the intrinsic merit. I mean, even if we were to grant for the sake of argument that English literature has greater intrinsic merit, only for the sake of argument, than many Indian literatures, Hindi literature begins quite clearly around the 8th or 9th century. Hindi literature has 4 epics, 5 epics written by the 1570s. I'm just giving broad facts so that a comparison can run in our minds, at the back of our minds, between one literature here, leave alone all the other literatures, some of which are even richer and even older. A comparison between that and English literature. So why do they not get their due? Because the English departments in our universities are what they are, and we are all complicit in it, all of us. The difference that we can make is try and using an Indian language in the classroom. You know, I wrote an article, a kind of a manifesto a very long time ago, in 1991, published 1993, in which I suggested that English studies, English departments in India may study an amalgam of 5 different elements. Then we studied only one element, literature written in English in England. Extending that, I said literature written in English in other parts of the world, literature available in English translation, literature in an Indian language, taught in an Indian language, whichever the local language may be. There will be enough people with competence to be able to do that. And then I really pushed my luck for the 5th element. I said at least 1 or 2 texts in a classical language which would not be Latin or Greek. We have classics of our own. And for the sake of parity, let's not only go to Sanskrit or Tamil, the 2 acknowledged classical languages. Let's also look at Persian, if you like, Arabic, which have also been part of our life for many centuries. So the 5th, of course, the 5th element was very, very hard to accomplish. Even the 4th could not be formally prescribed. But what I did in my own teaching in the University of Delhi, for example, when I taught Premchand or Shilal Shukla, I not only brought the Hindi text to class alongside the translation, I asked my students to do that. And that was no hardship, because not much of a hardship, because the Hindi text cost about half or 1/3 of the translated text. The economics of publishing in India in English and the economics of publishing in a language like Hindi in English in India are enormously different. I asked my friends in English language publishing, I said, how is it that Dak Darbari sells for 40 rupees in Hindi and 150 rupees or 200 rupees in English translation, when many pages have been cut out, so it's shorter? And he said, you know, we have overheads. I said, you mean your salary? What are overheads? It's not as if they print on better paper. So there is a disparity built into our society at every step. And all of us, as I said, are complicit. And if we become aware of this complicity more and more guiltily than we have so far, then maybe we might be able to do something about it. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Do you have time for more questions or it's up to you?
I'm at home.
Okay.
I'm not
All
going
right.
anywhere. Yeah.
Dr. Aditya Bhan also. I'm wondering who to invite now. Ashutosh Podar has raised hand. Maybe Ashutosh, can you?
Yes, I would love to go because the way Professor Trivedi has kind of brought in post-colonialism in the context of different languages. So, Professor Trivedi, I would like to ask you, then, do you think that the framework of post-colonial itself has to be readdressed when we think of languages in today's context? Languages and literatures in today's context uh, in different department of languages in India. Um, so we have to readdress and reframe the entire discourse of post-colonialism because if we are looking at, say, for instance, Hindi or Marathi, would this term called post-colonial be sufficient to look at? Because how do we as students would look into pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial Hindi or Marathi or Bengali? Yeah. So
No, I entirely agree. I sometimes wonder whether it's any use altering the frame of the post-colonial. The post-colonial, I think, has done its work. Let's try and find a new frame which will be more enabling. Let's not wait for it to come out of the West, because then again we'll be at a great disadvantage. How is it that nothing is arising here among us who actually teach it on the ground here? It's not as if we'll be doomed from the start, because let whatever new formulation of our teaching in a multilingual way, let whatever formulation arise here and let it prevail only here, only in India, and only in our English departments. Let us not be ambitious of reforming Columbia or Harvard or California or even London or Oxbridge. No, let them do what they like. If we can have just sufficient autonomy, not be totally oppressed by them, to do things as we like to do them, as are more suitable for us to do, that will be quite sufficient for our purpose. So many people want to learn English in India. Why? Not because they love English, not because English is a better language, but because all the privileges are to be had only through English. Who made it that way? We made it that way. There has been some chipping away at it.
yeah.
There have been some options given to some people. There are people who, in the IAS, who do not speak great English, and more power to them, because they can go into those services by appearing in an examination in a language other than English. But on the whole, the hegemony of English has only strengthened. It's not diminished. It's not lessened. Who will do that? We are the people selling English. We are the people practicing English. If we do not do it, who will come and do it? The others don't have the power to do it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Ashutosh, for your question. All of these are my colleagues at Flame. I'm really delighted by their questions. Maya, would you like to go for other comment? I think you're typing a lot of stuff here. Or should I go to
Thank
Aditya?
you.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll just quickly add to what you were saying, Professor Trivedi. So, two things come to mind. One is the lack of takers for language, pure language, at the undergraduate degree level. But there is a rise in a different constituency for this. And one is Urdu, I'll just paste the link, and the other is Pali. The people who are studying Pali in universities are not your average college level, entry level students, but the language is seeing a revival for other reasons. And I think that maybe the sort of traditional understanding of who is the student has to also shift. But I think I've said enough. So thank you so much for your time.
No, that's very interesting. The British taught us that in 1835, the British taught us, Macaulay and Hastings, that education was to be imparted for only one purpose, to get you a government job. This equation was not available in Britain or any other civilized society. This is something that they imposed here. They were the government, they would give us a job if we were educated in the Western system in the English language. That's why the greatest ambition until liberalization, until 1990-91, of any Indian was to get into the IAS. After that, they found that there was much more money to be made in the corporate world. So then the goalpost shifted. But there is still, and it's very odd. Allahabad, where I was a student, used to supply an obscene number of IAS officers from amongst the students. Then St. Stephen's College, where I came to teach in Delhi, became a major producer of IAS officers. And then Allahabad declined, St. Stephen's rose higher. So St. Stephen's, nobody sat for the IAS, they sat for CAT. While the center of aspiration for the IAS shifted to Bihar and to Eastern UP. People whose ambition is still was to get into government service because they were starting from that far back. So the sociology of what English does to us, what other languages can begin to do to us, and how we can intervene in that, how we can try and alter that. I don't know. I mean, we have to somehow lower the automatic residual cloud of English. And nobody is doing anything about it. I mean, it's very simple. Suppose we were to say, nobody can say it in India now. It'll be a question of human rights, quote unquote. Suppose we were to say all children should go to the neighborhood school where they're taught in the local language. There'll be no private schools. That'll be a start. Immediately, within 10 years, we'll see the results. Who will say that? Even politicians, chief ministers, are sending their children out to the West. So where does it begin? Where does change begin? Very hard to say. We live in the same unequal society and we make it more and more unequal.
I think Dr. Indrani Ram Prasad also has a comment, and then probably Aditya, and then Ashutosh has one more question. Yes. Indrani, do you want to go ahead?
Professor Jain, thank you for namaste to all, and thank you for this brilliant exposure here. I'm so bowled over by Professor Trivedi, and I am from Trinidad and Tobago, fourth generation born here. So I'm wondering in this discourse where I fit in, because in a way, what's his name? Naipaul kind of abandoned us. He did say, he was not of the colony, that he was like Rushdie, British. And I'm wondering in my mind where people like us fit in, because I did all my tertiary education in India, from my bachelor's come up to my PhD, out of wanting to get back to know my source, my ancestral heritage. I'm also an American citizen, but I didn't choose America for my education. I came to India. So there's a lot of us in the diaspora like that. But mind you, English is our language. That's the only language that we know. So there should be some space. I'm seeing in Professor Trivedi's discussion here, space for people like of Indian origin in another language. It's not, I hate to say this, British language is my language, but how do we get that space? Thank you. Brilliant presentation, Professor Trivedi. Brilliant.
Thank you very much. We're all we're all creatures of our circumstances. There is volition, there are options that we exercise, and then there are circumstances. If I were not born in the kind of family that I was, would I know such Hindi? If I had not gone to a Hindi medium school, would I actually be functional to this extent in Hindi? Would I know Sanskrit? Would I know Urdu? Is one of my tricks of the trade. In most lectures, I used to quote some Sanskrit and some Urdu. One has to quote both to show that one is secular and not lopsided. But it comes for so many of us rolling off the tip of our tongue. There's so many scholars who can do it in sleep. I'm nothing compared with them. So circumstances make me multilingual. Circumstances make some other people monolingual. It's not that they were always willing to be that, either multilingual or monolingual. We must honor the circumstances of our life. It does not do us any good to fret against them, especially post facto. But I think what can be done for each of us, what each of us can do in our own linguistically different situation or location, is to enhance our sensitivity to the existence of some other languages and linguistic cultures. Accessibility through translation has become easier now. There are not only many more translations coming out of Indian languages, I read quite a lot of them professionally. They're also getting better and better, and they're beginning to travel even to the West. So that is the opening of the door. That's a foot in the door. And language is the vehicle of a particular culture to which that language, of which that language is the marker. Even if we don't know the language, if we get more sensitive to that culture through translation, that is half the battle won. That is great progress made. It is not easy to learn languages. I mean, my heart still bleeds when I think of my early struggles with English. I'm still struggling with English. I write a page and I can myself find at least 4 or 5 mistakes in it. I don't know how many my readers find.
Brilliant, yeah.
So this is what happens to most of us after a lifetime spent in the service of English and the acquisition of English. Urdu I tried to learn with mixed results. Bangla I tried to learn with mixed results again, but very different, mixed in a very different way, which is itself quite instructive. Now, one can take small steps to come out of one's own linguistic ghetto, such as we have inherited, such as we have, without much of a choice, walked into. Or even if one can't do all that, one can at least show more sensitivity and a little bit more respect to other languages. That'll be a beginning.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Pankaj, I just want to make one recommendation here, that UNESCO has declared the rights of a child, your ancestral language, is a human right for children. And I think we use that a little more when we, for us, the Ramcharit Manas is a big thing, this part of the world. And as Professor was saying, we learn it through translation. We can sing it through the translation and not bog down with the Devanagari script itself. Thank you very much.
Oh,
Thank you.
The script is only the only the clothes. No, it's not the body nor the spirit. Yes. Though of course some people will tell you otherwise. Don't say that to an Urdu speaker. Yep.
All right, I think let's go to Aditya now, who has been waiting for a long time now. Aditya, you would like to ask the question or comment? Aditya is here, or Yes, sir.
Professor Pankaj, yes.
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yes. Go ahead, please. Yes.
Yeah. Professor Trivedi, thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask you, so in the context of one of your earlier statements where you had mentioned, and I believe it is also true to an extent, that one should not blame, for the sufferings as a civilization also, for the suffering at the hands of, let us say, the colonizers, etc. You should not completely blame the outsiders. I believe that. But even in independence India, for example, so the plight of Kashmiri Pandits, right, and the exodus that followed, the genocide that did take place. So for that also, oftentimes we have seen that in very influential circles and amongst thinkers and elites also, it is the Pandits who are blamed for what happened to them. So as if, you were elites who persecuted the, the less privileged over there, right? So you were the ones targeting the Muslims, and ultimately you suffered the consequences of what you did. So would you believe that this fits into that point of view, or does this represent an aberration?
It's not only the Kashmiri Pandits. Look at the Tamil Brahmins. Look at the Tamil language in relation to Sanskrit. Look at Urdu and Persian on the one hand, and Urdu and Hindi on the other hand. These permutations in history go on all the time. We can cite any number of examples. But let me go back to the point that you began with. For how long can you go on blaming the ills of the past and the evildoers of the past? That is regression, because that is not redressing the situation. If you blame the British for everything going on even now in India and feel happy, it is very superficial, flimsy happiness. It will not lead to any lasting remedy or satisfaction. Even now, very enlightened people, among my friends, many of them, say that Urdu and Hindi were the same language and the British divided them. Go on saying that, go on evading reality, go on evading history. In one respect, at least, they're still going on blaming the British. Similarly, regarding the Kashmiris and the Tamil Brahmins, in relation to the lower castes in Tamil Nadu and to non-Hindus in Kashmir, it is the reaction against the elite, against a very small elite who, because they were literate, held privileges when literacy was extremely low. That is one commonality between these two ends of India, Kashmir and Tamil Nadu. It existed in between as well, all across India, and not only India. Look at the privileges that literacy brought and scholarship brought in Europe throughout their history. Until literacy of a high level gets up to, say, 95% in a country, and until there are employment opportunities which are as lucrative for the non-literate or semi-literate as they are for the highly literate, this will continue. One of the biggest shocks I got in 1971 when I went to Britain, I used to read the newspaper quite avidly, including things that should not have interested me. And one day I found an advertisement for a chauffeur for a Rolls Royce that someone wanted who was living in London. And the salary offered was £1,500 per annum, I think it was. And the salary of a lecturer in the university where I was studying was 1,400 something per annum. In India, one cannot imagine this. A bricklayer in England earned a lot more than a university professor, a truck driver. That's another kind of equality and the chipping away at the value, the monopoly value of literacy. Different societies are differently organized. I don't know from when, in the Vedic times, there was no literacy, hardly any. It was all oral. So we are told. So it goes in cycles, privilege goes in cycles, elite formation goes in cycles. And I hope that ultimately through all these revolutions, not revolution in the sense of that Marx meant it, the going round and round of social equations, social formations. I hope that ultimately we are heading towards more equality, more equitability, more fairness.
Okay, Ashutosh, I guess the turn
Yeah.
comes back to you.
No,
Yeah.
actually, Professor Trivedi has already beautifully explained what I
Okay.
had in my mind. So, yeah, I
All
don't
right,
have
great.
question. Yeah,
Super.
thank
Anybody
you.
else would like to ask or say something? Anything relevant to the topic? Anybody else? All right. I think we are all in awe of all these points that you made, and
Pankaj, I must say that for a numerically small audience, you've really given me a run for my money. I've never had so many questions from an audience which
wonderful.
was so small, and three of whom, being my old friends, are giving me the benefit of doubt and not asking any questions.
I certainly
Wonderful,
learned a
wonderful.
lot, so
Yeah,
I hope everybody can agree to that. And at
yeah.
least you
Very
gave us a lot of
informative. Yeah,
food to thought, food to think, and a lot of
yeah.
things
It feels
to
like
think
a
about.
small, feels
Oh,
like a small
Sharda
group.
has raised her hand,
Yeah,
all the way
thanks.
from Birmingham in UK. Sharda ji, please
Yeah.
go ahead.
Should
My
I?
question does not relate directly to literature.
Hmm.
Well, I'm just wondering, I could be wrong here. Harish, correct me. I gather that in our census during the, I do agree with you that we can't be blaming the British for the past. I totally agree with you. But sometimes we tend to replicate colonial attitudes even now in India or abroad. That's one point. And I understand in our census, I remember my father telling me, very vaguely though, that we have to enter our caste and religion. And that was mainly because the British wanted it. So since then, what has happened is we are trying to define religion mostly in the 19th century Western terms. So in terms of fixed beliefs and practices. So if you have to be a Buddhist, you will have to reject Hinduism. And if you're a Sikh, you will have to reject Hinduism. In one sense, if you look at the Sikh Maryada Act, so it says those who become Sikhs will have to reject. So in one sense, this um, uh, is in tune with Western understanding. If you accept one, you have to reject the other.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in one sense, are we not in one sense replicating that Western understanding of religion or whatever? I'm putting it very badly, but I hope you understand.
No, I especially understand things which are put badly. If they are put well, I have some trouble. For example, I don't understand Homi Baba all the time. So we all have that problem. Sharda, I don't know whether I should make it public to everyone what has already emerged from your comment and question, that you are a great expert in comparative religion.
Not
And
expert.
well, you've been into it for a long time. Nobody wants to be called an expert, especially if they are experts. So it's only those who don't know much who are experts, self-appointed. I agree with you that we are perpetuating a number of things that perhaps first happened or were first institutionalized during colonial rule, during British rule. Now, that is the failure of our independence. Premchand wrote, what is independence worth if instead of a white sahab, a brown sahab begins going to Shimla for 6 months during the year? If a brown sahab occupies huge bungalows and palaces because he rules over us. If the conduct is the same of the Indian ruler as it was of the British ruler, if the mindset is the same, that is not independence. That, I think, is what you were saying. That we are still bound by those old conventions, those old practices, even the old mindset we have inherited. I totally agree with you.
Yeah, some of the binary categories we have inherited.
Yeah.
And when it's convenient, we apply to suit our own agenda, so to speak. Like, for example, we have a very strong pluralistic framework, but now that is being downsized, and we have a very linear monotheistic framework is being imposed for certain goals to be accomplished. Okay, so sometimes it's just, so we are replicating this sort of.
I don't know. Monotheism would be a very good thing, because then we can't build a temple to it. We have Advait. So I don't know whether we are heading in that direction. But to go back to the colonial situation, you know, there's some very fine studies, very nuanced studies of what the British did. And one of the points that I like very much when it's made in different historical contexts is that the British hardly invented anything in India.
Yeah, that's true.
They found prejudices here, they found divisions here, and like nice pragmatic men, they aggravated those divisions, divide and rule, and it suited them to be more strongly in power in order to foster divisions and dissensions within our society. Any ruler would do that. Divide and rule was not a monopoly of the British. Even now we are practicing that in all kinds of ways. The stratagems for keeping people quiet and ruling over them are perhaps universal. The historical context, therefore, needs to be understood in terms of what is changing, what we want to change, and what those who are in power do not wish to change, because it suits them. So you're perfectly right. You're perfectly right about that. Naipaul, incidentally, has been mentioned twice. Naipaul was one of the first persons to say in this whole post-colonial discourse that we should stop blaming the British, or we'll go on blaming the British forever after and never begin blaming ourselves. That is the danger of blaming the British or blaming old structures, because then we don't take responsibility. I like Naipaul quite a lot. I'm glad I'm saying it so late in the proceedings.
All right. Anybody else? Any other thought, comment, question? We will post it on YouTube, and we hope we'll get more comments, and we'll post your abstract, your bio, everything on our university's YouTube channel and elsewhere. And Professor Mayadod is asking for your Twitter handle. If you're on Twitter, we can all follow you. At least I can follow you, but probably you're not on Twitter.
Maybe privately I can take some tutorials from someone. Before I go on there. I have a Twitter account.
Oh, you do? Okay.
And that is because Twitter itself created that account.
Okay.
I have an email account.
Okay.
Because email for an old person like me, email still is better than WhatsApp. And for many people, Twitter is even better than WhatsApp. So I know I'm not marching ahead with the times. I know that. But Twitter I follow passively. So, so if for example, that episode that I told you about Abdul Razak Gurna and Salman Rushdie, used to edit a book on whom.
Oh yeah.
I saw that on Twitter.
Oh, wonderful.
But sometimes when I want to respond to it, I don't know where it goes. It never shows. So that is the height of my competence. Yeah.
I should mention to Professor Trivedi, there is somebody, who's called Dr. Harish Trivedi, who I realized is not you, who's on Twitter. And Salman Rushdie had a fight with somebody else who called himself Salman Rushdie. Got him booted off Twitter to become the real Salman Rushdie. So might be the real Harish Trivedi account.
In that case, maybe I should not go on Twitter.
But sir, you're already there.
Exactly.
But Twitter should provide you bloat text, so you're verified Harish Trivedi. They do that also. Yeah. Indrani, you want to add something? Your hand is up of Indrani also. Dr. Indrani Ramprasad?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I wanted to point out that the work of Frantz Fanon and Aimé Césaire in my part of the world, in the Caribbean, Fanon made the very deep observation that in post-colonial conditions, that the oppressed, that class will come up. And when the emerging elite they replace the previous colonizer. So I think we need to be aware of that and ready to respond. And finally, I would suggest, Professor Pankaj, a little study circle, around this topic that the great ones amongst us, Professor Trivedi, Shardaji, and others, yourself, all of us, that we can continue this with a little study intense, because I'm seeing a rising India where it is going to have its own terminologies, its own voice, and the hegemony of North America and the European world in the discourse. India has to get its own discourse with its own name or own terminologies. And I think
agree. I quite agree. As for Fanon, I myself was deeply into Fanon. In fact, I taught a course at Chicago on Gandhi and Fanon, semester course.
Wow.
I must say that Fanon, I don't need to say that. I don't need to praise him for him to be great. He's already acknowledged to be full of original insights. And I think the fact of his having been a doctor and what we'll now call a psychologist or psychoanalyst helped tremendously for him to uncover the deeper repercussions of colonialism. At the same time, he also held a position where change was hardly possible without extreme violence. And that was the wonderful point of comparison, I thought, between Gandhi and Fanon, and the rationale behind putting them together on the same page, as it were. Of course, people have their own preferences in different historical situations. In Algeria, he saw a very different reality. So, and in the Caribbean, I'm very fond of Césaire, M. Césaire. He has wonderful insights, which again are comparable with those of Fanon. So there are many options, not options, there are many avenues before us, and we can travel down each one of them and see what speaks to us and appeals to us. They are all, they all had wonderful insights into the colonial situation. And they did not have the same insight, thankfully. They would never have agreed with each other. So that only goes to show that, there are many ways of understanding it, each as rich as the other.
Wonderful. On that great Gandhian note, I think Gandhi. Yeah, I think one figure that we can all probably agree is Gandhi. So it's a great way to end the great lecture by Professor Harish Trivedi, and looking forward to invite you again, sir. And with that, with all my thanks from all my colleagues and all the participants, thanks to the participants for participating and asking great questions from Professor Harish Trivedi. One task I have assigned myself after this is to get all your books to my Flame University Library. We already have, thankfully, we have sent so many of your books already here. But whatever is missing, we'll try to add those also. Thank you again, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful
audience. Wonderful audience. I mean, you worked as hard as I did.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Namaste.